December 16th, 1944. The frozen forests of the Ardennes stood silent under a blanket of snow and fog that reduced visibility to mere yards. Along an 80-mile front stretching from southern Belgium through Luxembourg, American troops huddled in their positions, convinced that this quiet sector was a safe place to rest and refit. After all, German generals themselves had declared the Ardennes impassable for large-scale military operations. The terrain was too rugged, the roads too few, the forests too dense for modern mechanized warfare. Or so everyone believed. At 5:30 a.m., the silence shattered. Over 900 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, creating a rolling thunder that could be heard 20 miles away. Within minutes, 200,000 German soldiers and 1,000 tanks began pouring through the morning darkness, launching Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. The irony was profound. The same terrain that German generals had confidently dismissed as an insurmountable barrier in 1940, allowing them to justify concentrating their defences elsewhere, was now being used for the largest German offensive on the Western Front. The Americans were about to discover what the French had learned 4 years earlier, that military impossibility is often just a failure of imagination. The Ardennes, a heavily forested plateau spanning eastern Belgium, northern Luxembourg and parts of France and Germany, had shaped military thinking for decades. Rising from river valleys to heights of 2,000 feet, cut by deep ravines and swift-flowing streams, covered in dense mixed forest, it seemed designed by nature to prevent military movement. The road network was sparse, mostly narrow tracks that wound through valleys and over ridges. In winter, snow and ice made these routes treacherous. In spring and fall, mud rendered them impassable. Only summer offered decent conditions, and even then, the forest canopy blocked observation and limited manoeuvre. French military doctrine between the wars had evolved around the certainty that the Ardennes was a natural fortress requiring minimal defence. General Henri Pétain, the hero of Verdun, had declared it militarily impenetrable in a 1934 assessment. His logic seemed sound. Any attacker would be channeled onto predictable routes, vulnerable to artillery fire from prepared positions. Tanks, the new weapon that had terrorized the Western Front in 1918, would be helpless in the narrow forest defiles. An attack through the Ardennes would take weeks to develop, giving defenders ample time to respond. The Maginot Line, France's fortress system designed to prevent another German invasion, deliberately ended at the southern edge of the Ardennes, precisely because military experts believed nature had already fortified that sector. The few divisions stationed in the region were second-rate, under-equipped and under-trained. They were there as a tripwire, not a defensive force. In May 1940, German generals exploited this assumption with devastating effect. While the world expected a repeat of the 1914 Schlieffen Plan, with German armies wheeling through Belgium, Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and other advocates of mechanized warfare convinced Hitler to attempt the impossible. 7 Panzer divisions representing the core of Germany's armoured striking power would drive through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and race to the English Channel, cutting off Allied armies in Belgium. The operation, full Gelb, depended entirely on speed and surprise. If the French discovered the plan, if they reinforced the Ardennes in time, the entire German offensive would dissolve into a traffic jam of immobilized tanks in narrow forest roads, exactly the scenario French doctrine predicted. On May 10, 1940, the gamble began. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, 3 armoured divisions totalling over 800 tanks, entered the Ardennes forest through narrow roads that military experts had declared unsuitable for armour. Behind them stretched a column of vehicles that extended for 100 miles, vulnerable to air attack, confined to predictable routes, exactly the kind of target that should have been destroyed piecemeal. But the French, confident in their assessment that the Ardennes was impassable, had positioned their weakest forces there. The few reconnaissance units that spotted the German columns reported them as minor probes, diversions from the main attack expected in Belgium. French air reconnaissance was limited by cloudy weather and the forest canopy that concealed the massive German movement. By May 13th, German tanks had traversed terrain that French generals had declared impassable and reached the Meuse River at Sedan. Within 24 hours they had crossed and were racing through open country toward the Channel. The campaign that military experts predicted would take weeks was over in 6 days. France, considered the world's premier military power, collapsed not because its army was defeated in battle, but because German armour had gone where French doctrine said it could not go. The psychological impact was devastating. French generals, confronted with reports of German tanks where no tanks should be, refused to believe their own intelligence. By the time they accepted reality, it was too late. The same formations that should have been easy targets in the Ardennes forest were now rampaging through northern France, and the entire Allied position in Belgium was collapsing. When Hitler began planning his winter 1944 offensive, he remembered the Ardennes. The strategic situation was desperate. Soviet armies were approaching Germany's eastern borders. Anglo-American forces had liberated France and were preparing to invade Germany from the west. German industry was being pounded by round-the-clock bombing. Fuel shortages were crippling military operations. Manpower losses exceeded replacements. Every rational military analysis concluded that Germany had lost the war and should seek the best. Surrender terms possible. Hitler rejected rationality. He envisioned a massive counteroffensive that would split the Western Allies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and destroy 30 Allied divisions. The shock would force Britain and America to negotiate, allowing Germany to concentrate all forces against the Soviets. It was fantasy, but Hitler had the power to make fantasy operational. The Ardennes offered several advantages for this desperate plan. The sector was lightly defended, held primarily by inexperienced American divisions resting after heavy fighting, or green units newly arrived from the United States. The forest and winter weather would ground Allied air power, negating the overwhelming aerial superiority that had devastated every German offensive since D-Day. The terrain, while difficult, could be traversed, as the Germans had proven in 1940. Most importantly, Allied commanders believed the Ardennes was secure precisely because the terrain made a major offensive there unlikely. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, nominal commander of German forces in the West, considered the plan insane. General Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, called it impossible with available resources, but both were professional soldiers who followed orders. Throughout November 1944, Germany assembled its last strategic reserve. 3 armies, totaling 30 divisions including 10 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, concentrated in the Eifel region opposite the Ardennes. Over 400 tanks and assault guns, including new King Tigers and Panthers, were brought forward. Artillery was massed in concentrations not seen since 1918. Fuel and ammunition, desperately scarce everywhere else, were stockpiled for the offensive. Security was absolute. Radio silence was enforced. Movement occurred only at night. Units were told they were assembling for defensive operations. Even division commanders didn't learn the truth until days before the attack. The deception worked perfectly. Allied intelligence, despite decoding German communications through Ultra, completely missed the build-up. On the American side, the Ardennes sector was considered a quiet zone, perfect for resting exhausted divisions or blooding new ones. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from the United States with no combat experience, held a dangerously extended position on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. The 28th Infantry Division, badly mauled in the Hürtgen Forest, was refitting in Luxembourg. The 99th Infantry Division, another green unit, manned positions north of the breakthrough zone. The 4th Infantry Division, veterans of Utah Beach and the liberation of Paris, held the southern shoulder. These divisions were spread impossibly thin, defending frontages that doctrine said required twice their numbers. In some sectors there was 1 American soldier for every 100 yards of front. Outposts were separated by miles of forest where no one patrolled. The Americans knew the positions were weak, but they accepted the risk based on the same calculation that had doomed the French in 1940. The Germans wouldn't attack through the Ardennes because the terrain made a successful offensive impossible. Major General Troy Middleton, commanding 8 corps in the sector, repeatedly warned his superiors that his forces were stretched too thin. He was told that calculated risks were necessary, that the Germans lacked the strength for a major offensive, that the Ardennes terrain made attack unlikely. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, considered the sector so secure that he maintained his headquarters in the Spa town of Spa, Belgium, 30 miles behind the front. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower was planning his own offensives further north and south, where terrain favoured mobile operations. The Ardennes was simply the quiet place in between, a backwater where nothing important would happen. German assault troops who moved into their jump-off positions on the night of December 15th knew otherwise. They had been briefed on the plan, shown maps of their objectives, and told this was Germany's last chance. Many were sceptical. They had heard grand promises before, seen operations collapse under Allied air power, watched offensives stall for lack of fuel, but they were soldiers, and they would do their duty. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the artillery barrage began. Searchlights bounced beams off low clouds, creating artificial moonlight that allowed German infantry to navigate the dark forest. The plan called for infantry to infiltrate American positions, creating gaps for armour to exploit. Speed was everything. The panzers had to reach the Meuse River bridges within 48 hours before American reserves could respond. The initial American reaction was confusion. The scale of the barrage suggested a major attack, but attacks didn't happen in the Ardennes. Units reported being overrun, losing contact with headquarters, falling back through the forest. The communications breakdown was severe. Phone lines were cut by artillery. Radio signals were blocked by terrain. For hours, higher headquarters had only fragmentary reports suggesting localized attacks. By mid-morning, the truth was becoming clear. This wasn't a spoiling attack or a local counteroffensive. German forces were attacking along the entire Ardennes front with strength that shouldn't exist. The 106th Division on the Schneeifel found itself surrounded, 2 entire regiments cut off by German armour that had bypassed their positions. The 28th Division's front was penetrated in multiple places. The 99th Division was being hammered by attacks of overwhelming strength. In the critical sector at Losheim Gap, a natural corridor through the high ground, the Germans achieved complete breakthrough. The 1st SS Panzer Division under Joachim Peiper, spearheading the northern thrust, poured through this gap with 100 tanks and 5,000 men, racing westward on a narrow road that led deep into the American rear. The German offensive had achieved surprise so complete that some American units were overrun before they could man their weapons. Others, isolated in the forest, fought desperate delaying actions against overwhelming odds. The speed of the German advance created chaos. Supply dumps were overrun, headquarters evacuated under fire, and entire battalions simply disappeared in the confusion. But the Germans were discovering that the Ardennes terrain that had shielded their approach was now hindering their advance. The narrow roads forced armour into single-file columns. Villages that should have been bypassed became choke points when American defenders held crossroads. The dense forest prevented armoured manoeuvre, forcing German tanks to stay on roads where they were vulnerable. The weather that grounded Allied aircraft also made the primitive road network a muddy nightmare. Fuel consumption exceeded planning assumptions as tanks manoeuvred through difficult terrain. The critical factor that German planners had underestimated was American resilience. Individual units, surrounded and cut off, chose to fight rather than surrender. Small groups of defenders, holding crossroads villages or bridge sites, delayed German columns for hours or days. The 7th Armoured Division, rushed south to the vital road junction at St. Vith, arrived just in time to prevent German armour from seizing the town. At Bastogne, an even more critical junction where 7 roads converged, the 101st Airborne Division rushed forward from reserve, dug in, and refused to yield despite being completely surrounded. These defensive stands, often by outnumbered and outgunned forces, bought time for the American command to respond. Within 24 hours of the initial attack, Eisenhower recognized the German offensive for what it was, a major effort that required maximum response. He ordered all offensive operations halted and all available reserves sent to the Ardennes. The speed of American reaction demonstrated a flexibility that German planning had not anticipated. Patton's Third Army, attacking toward the Saar, was ordered to disengage, wheel 90 degrees north, and counterattack into the German southern flank. This manoeuvre, moving an entire army across the front of an enemy offensive in winter conditions, was the kind of operation that should take weeks to plan. Patton promised to attack in 48 hours. The northern shoulder of the German penetration became a killing ground. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, reinforced by elements of the 1st Infantry Division, held a series of ridgelines that denied German forces access to road networks leading to Liège and Antwerp. Repeated German attacks, often by elite SS units, were repulsed with heavy losses. The Americans were learning that forest fighting favoured the defender, the same lesson the Germans should have remembered from 1940. In the centre, the situation was more dangerous. Kampfgruppe Piper, the armoured spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, had advanced 50 miles in 2 days, the deepest penetration of the offensive. Piper's column murdered American prisoners at Malmedy in one of the war's most notorious atrocities, then raced toward the Meuse River, leaving destruction in its wake. But Piper was discovering the fundamental problem with the Ardennes terrain. His advance was confined to a single road. When American engineers blew bridges ahead of him, his entire column halted while engineers built bypasses. When he deviated from the main route seeking alternate roads, he found them too narrow or too weak for his 70-ton King Tiger tanks. Fuel consumption in the stop-and-go movement through difficult terrain was exceeding supply. By December 18th, Piper's spearhead, the deepest German penetration, was surrounded in the village of Stoumont, out of fuel and under attack from 3 directions. The Germans had advanced further than they had in 1940, but they were about to learn that reaching a position and holding it were different problems. American forces were counter-attacking before the German offensive even reached its planned objectives. The weather, initially favouring the Germans by grounding Allied aircraft, began clearing on December 23rd. The result was catastrophic for German forces. Hundreds of Allied fighters and bombers, no longer restricted by clouds, descended on German columns strung out on narrow Ardennes roads. The fighter-bombers found targets beyond their capacity to destroy, endless columns of vehicles jammed nose to tail, unable to disperse in the confined terrain. The same forest roads that had protected the German approach in 1940 now became killing grounds. A single destroyed vehicle could block an entire column for hours while it was pushed aside. German fuel trucks, desperately needed at the front, burned on roads throughout the Ardennes. The planned capture of American fuel dumps, essential to German calculations, had largely failed. Defenders burned the supplies before retreating. The few dumps captured contained diesel fuel useless for German gasoline engines. By Christmas, German armour was advancing on fumes, literally. Tanks were abandoned when they ran dry. Assaults were cancelled because panzers lacked fuel to reach their start lines. The offensive that should have reached Antwerp in a week hadn't even crossed the Meuse River, still 40 miles from its first phase objectives. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne refused German surrender demands with a one-word reply that became legendary: nuts. The town's 7 road junctions, essential for German logistics, remained in American hands. German forces bypassed Bastogne and continued west, but their supply columns couldn't get through, forcing ever longer detours on increasingly inadequate roads. On December 22nd, Patton's Third Army attacked from the south, exactly 48 hours after receiving orders. 3 divisions struck the German southern flank, forcing Model to divert forces from the Western Drive to protect his overstretched lines. The German offensive, already behind schedule and short of fuel, was now fighting in 3 directions simultaneously. The Battle of the Bulge, named for the distinctive salient German forces had created in Allied lines, had become a battle of attrition, exactly the kind of fight Germany couldn't win. American numerical superiority, initially negated by surprise, was now decisive. Fresh divisions arrived daily, American industry provided unlimited supplies, and Allied air power dominated the skies. German forces, initially 200,000 strong, were being ground down in brutal combat across frozen forests. Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal, insisting his forces continue attacking toward Antwerp despite lacking fuel, ammunition, and air cover. Division commanders pleaded for permission to withdraw before the salient became a trap. Model and von Rundstedt warned that the offensive had failed and continuation meant destroying the forces that might defend Germany itself. Hitler dismissed their concerns, blamed subordinates for lack of will, and ordered renewed attacks. On December 26th, elements of Patton's 4th Armoured Division broke through to Bastogne, ending the siege. The relief column's arrival demonstrated American capabilities that German planning had dismissed as impossible. Moving an entire army 100 miles in winter, coordinating attacks by multiple divisions, and breaking through to a surrounded garrison, all accomplished in 4 days. By January 1st, 1945, the German offensive was clearly defeated. The westward drive had stopped 50 miles short of the Meuse River. Fuel exhaustion had immobilized most German armour. Allied counterattacks were compressing the bulge from north and south. Hitler finally authorized limited withdrawals, but the roads that had barely sustained the German advance couldn't support orderly retreat under air attack. German formations that had entered the Ardennes with full strength were decimated. The elite panzer divisions stripped from the Eastern Front for this operation were shadows of their former power. The Luftwaffe, making a desperate effort to support the offensive, lost 1,000 aircraft it couldn't replace. German casualties exceeded 100,000 killed, wounded and captured. Over 600 tanks and assault guns were lost, destroyed in combat or abandoned for lack of fuel. The artillery that opened the offensive with such devastating effect was now scattered across Belgium, much of it out of ammunition. Equipment losses were catastrophic, but the loss of trained personnel was irreplaceable. The German army in January 1945 had consumed its last reserves in a failed gamble. When Soviet forces launched their winter offensive weeks later, Germany lacked mobile reserves to respond. The forces destroyed in the Ardennes might have delayed the Red Army's advance for months. By February, American and British forces had eliminated the Bulge and resumed their advance toward the Rhine. The month-long delay caused by the German offensive was frustrating, but strategically insignificant. Germany had gained nothing except time, and paid for that time with an army it desperately needed for defence. The Ardennes offensive revealed fundamental flaws in German strategic thinking. Hitler and his inner circle, divorced from military reality, believed that will and surprise could overcome material disadvantages. They planned an operation requiring resources Germany didn't possess, fuel it couldn't provide, and air superiority it had lost. The assumption that the Ardennes terrain would protect German forces from Allied air power collapsed the moment weather cleared. The roads that channeled the 1940 advance now trapped German columns under relentless aerial attack. The forest that provided concealment in 1940 prevented the dispersal that might have reduced air attack effectiveness in 1944. Most critically, German planners underestimated American capabilities. The assumptions that American troops would panic and retreat, that American commanders would respond slowly, that American logistics couldn't support rapid redeployment, all proved false. The US Army of December 1944 was not the French Army of May 1940. American forces, surprised and initially driven back, reorganized and counterattacked with speed that shocked German commanders. The terrain that German generals in 1940 had correctly identified as difficult but not impassable had not changed. What changed was the military situation surrounding it. In 1940, German forces had faced an enemy convinced that the Ardennes was impassable and therefore barely defended. In 1944, German forces faced an enemy that rapidly concentrated overwhelming force once the attack was detected. The Ardennes, far from being militarily impassable, had now witnessed two of the war's major offensives. The terrain had not prevented either attack. But in both cases, the attacking force discovered that difficult terrain cut both ways. The same factors that hindered defence also hindered offence. The forest roads that concealed approach also channeled advance. The weather that grounded enemy aircraft also hindered friendly movement. For the soldiers who fought in the winter forest, the Battle of the Bulge was the deadliest American battle of the war in Europe. Nearly 20,000 Americans killed, 60,000 wounded or captured, in fighting that raged through frozen forests and snowbound villages. Small unit actions, often unsupported and isolated, determined the outcome as much as grand strategy. Companies and battalions, holding critical crossroads or defending nameless villages, absorbed German attacks that should have broken through. The citizen soldiers of the American army, many in combat for the first time, discovered reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. Tank destroyers, outnumbered and outgunned by German Tigers and Panthers, fought from ambush positions in the forest, trading mobility for surprise. Artillery forward observers, often the only Americans with radio contact to higher headquarters, called fire on their own positions when German infantry overran them. Engineers, trained for construction, fought as infantry when German breakthrough threatened to collapse the entire front. Medics worked under fire to evacuate wounded through forest trails under German observation. The individual acts of courage, the small unit stands, the desperate last-ditch defences, these determined the battle's outcome as much as Eisenhower's strategic decisions or Patton's dramatic counterattack. The teenagers and factory workers in American uniform, dismissed by German veterans as inferior troops, proved as stubborn in defence as any soldiers in history. German veterans, many of whom had fought on the Eastern Front, reported that American resistance exceeded anything they had experienced against the Soviets. The willingness to fight when surrounded, the refusal to yield ground even when retreat was rational, the stubborn defence of positions that military logic said were untenable, all surprised German commanders who had expected American morale to collapse under pressure. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Divisions repulsed attacks by 4 German divisions, including the 12th SS Panzer Division. At St. Vith, the 7th Armoured Division and attached units held for 6 days against attacks by 5 divisions. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held for 7 days while surrounded. These defensive stands, bought with American lives, consumed German time and strength. The offensive couldn't afford to lose. The Battle of the Bulge destroyed the myth that terrain could prevent military operations. The Ardennes was not impassable in 1940, and it was not impassable in 1944. What the terrain did was complicate operations for both sides, creating conditions where tactical skill, soldier quality, and logistical preparation mattered more than strategic planning. The Germans in 1940 succeeded because they were better prepared, better trained, and faced an enemy that refused to believe the attack was possible until too late. The Germans in 1944 failed because they lacked fuel, faced an enemy that responded with unexpected speed, and discovered that surprise alone couldn't overcome material disadvantages. The Americans learned what the French should have learned in 1940. Terrain doesn't make military operations impossible, it makes them difficult. Difficult is not the same as impossible. The proper response to an attack through difficult terrain is not dismissal but preparation. The improper response is the one both the French in 1940 and the Americans in 1944 initially made, assuming that because the terrain was difficult, the enemy wouldn't attempt it. In January 1945, as American forces compressed the Bulge and prepared to resume their advance into Germany, military analysts were already studying the battle for lessons. The official after-action reports noted that the Ardennes offensive succeeded initially not because of German strength or Allied weakness, but because Allied commanders had made the same mistake their French predecessors made, assuming terrain would do their defensive work for them. The report's conclusion was stark. There is no such thing as impassable terrain, only terrain that has not yet been passed. Military planning based on assumptions of impassability invites disaster. The enemy will always attempt what we believe impossible, and we must be prepared for attacks that doctrine says cannot occur. The German generals who declared the Ardennes impassable in 1940 were proven wrong by their own forces. The Allied generals who considered the Ardennes secure in 1944 were proven wrong by those same German forces. The terrain had not changed, only the armies crossing it. By the spring of 1940, American forces stood on the Rhine, preparing for the final advance into Germany. The month lost to the Ardennes offensive was recovered through relentless pressure on all fronts. The German forces destroyed in Belgium were not replaced. The fuel consumed in the offensive was not replenished. The aircraft lost in futile support missions were not rebuilt. Hitler's gamble had failed completely. The Ardennes, twice the scene of major German offensives, would not see a third. The forest that had witnessed the collapse of France in 1940 and the near disaster of American arms in 1944 returned to quiet. The narrow roads where American and German youth had killed each other in frozen forests grew silent. Today, the Ardennes remains what it always was, heavily forested, sparsely populated, cut by narrow valleys and swift streams. The terrain that military planners called impassable has not changed. What changed was the understanding that terrain difficulty is a challenge to be overcome, not a guarantee of security. The generals, German and Allied, who learned this lesson paid for their education with their soldiers' lives. The Battle of the Bulge stands as the ultimate refutation of the doctrine of impassable terrain. The German generals who said it couldn't be done did it anyway in 1940. The Allied generals who should have learned that lesson were surprised when the Germans did it again in 1944. And the soldiers on both sides discovered that military necessity cares nothing for terrain assessments or staff officer conclusions about what is possible. When armies need to go somewhere, they go, regardless of what maps and terrain analysis suggest. The Ardennes was never impassable, it was simply difficult, and difficulty has never stopped determined soldiers backed by competent leadership and adequate supplies. The problem in both 1940 and 1944 was not that the terrain allowed passage, but that defenders assumed it would not. The lesson, bought at immense cost in both battles, is that military planning must never assume terrain will do what soldiers should do. Defense requires defenders, not assumptions. The Ardennes taught that lesson twice, and the price of that education was paid in the blood of French soldiers in 1940 and American soldiers in 1944. The terrain remains unchanged and indifferent. The roads still wind through the forests, the rivers still cut through the valleys, the ridges still command the approaches. None of it prevented passage then, and none of it would prevent passage now. The only thing that changes is whether armies are prepared for attacks through terrain they assumed was secure. German generals thought the Ardennes was impassable, until they proved themselves wrong. French generals agreed, until German tanks appeared where French doctrine said they could not be. American generals believed the sector was secure, until German artillery shattered the winter morning with the opening barrage of Hitler's last offensive. The Ardennes was never impassable, it was simply underestimated. And that underestimation, twice repeated, led to two of the most dramatic military operations of World War II. The lesson stands, written in the snow and mud of Belgian forests, paid for with the lives of soldiers who learned too late that terrain guarantees nothing, and assumptions of military impossibility are invitations to disaster. The names of the battles that followed the German withdrawal from the Ardennes tell their own story of how completely the strategic situation had reversed. Operation Blackcock, Operation Veritable, Operation Grenade, the successive Allied offensives that ground through the Rhineland in early 1945, faced determined German resistance, but never again faced the kind of massed counter-offensive that had exploded through the Ardennes. Germany had shot its bolt, and the arrow had fallen short. The operational analysis conducted by Allied intelligence in February 1945 revealed details about the German planning that made the Ardennes offensive even more remarkable in its ambition and more tragic in its inevitable failure. Captured documents showed that Hitler had personally designed the operational framework, overriding objections from every senior commander. Von Rundstedt had proposed a limited offensive to pinch off American forces in the Aachen salient, an operation within German capabilities that might achieve tactical success. Model had suggested a defensive strategy, using Germany's remaining armour to counterattack Allied penetrations rather than launching a strategic offensive. Both proposals were rejected. Hitler insisted on Antwerp as the objective, a goal that required crossing 125 miles of difficult terrain, seizing multiple river crossings, and sustaining a deep penetration through the strongest concentration of Allied forces in Europe. The plan required 5 million gallons of fuel. Germany had 3 million available and no prospect of obtaining more. It required 1,400 aircraft for air support. The Luftwaffe could barely sustain 800, and most of those were needed for defense of the Reich against bomber attacks. It required American forces to retreat in panic, Allied reserves to respond slowly, and weather to remain poor for at least 2 weeks. Every assumption was wrong. The captured planning documents revealed another factor that explained German confidence despite material shortages. Intelligence assessments prepared for Hitler by his staff painted a picture of Allied weakness that bore no relationship to reality. American divisions were described as undertrained and poorly led. British forces were characterized as exhausted and unwilling to take casualties. Allied logistics were assessed as barely adequate, vulnerable to disruption. Allied air superiority was acknowledged but dismissed as ineffective in winter weather. These intelligence failures weren't the result of poor information gathering. German intelligence had reasonably accurate data on Allied force dispositions, unit strengths, and equipment. The failure was analytical, a systematic tendency to interpret all information in ways that confirmed Hitler's desired conclusions. When intelligence contradicted the planned operations assumptions, the intelligence was dismissed as defeatist or inaccurate. German field commanders knew better. The combat veterans who would lead the offensive understood they were being ordered to attempt the impossible with inadequate means. But the German military culture, particularly by late 1944, didn't permit open disagreement with Hitler's decisions. Officers who expressed doubt were relieved of command or worse. The result was an offensive launched by commanders who privately believed it would fail, leading soldiers who deserved better than to be expended in a futile gesture. The soldiers themselves, German and American, knew nothing of grand strategy. They fought in frozen forests where visibility was measured in yards, and survival depended on small unit cohesion and individual courage. The American infantryman holding a foxhole in the Ardennes forest wasn't defending a strategic position. He was trying to stay alive while German artillery searched for his position and German infantry probed his lines. The German panzer grenadier advancing through those same forests wasn't executing a brilliant strategic maneuver. He was following orders to keep moving forward despite mounting casualties and dwindling supplies. The forest fighting was brutal beyond what either side expected. The dense evergreen woods that covered much of the Ardennes provided concealment, but eliminated the long-range observation that favoured defence. Combat occurred at ranges where rifles and grenades were more useful than artillery. American positions, often just holes scraped in frozen ground, were invisible until attackers were within yards. German infiltration tactics, developed on the Eastern Front, worked perfectly in terrain where defenders couldn't see attackers until they were already through the lines. But the same terrain that favoured German infiltration hindered German exploitation. When panzer units broke through American positions, they discovered that pursuit through dense forest was impossible. Tanks couldn't leave the roads without risking immobilization in soft ground hidden beneath snow. Infantry couldn't keep pace with armour on open roads under American artillery fire. The result was a stop-and-go advance where breakthroughs were achieved but not exploited, where American positions were overrun but survivors escaped to reform defensive lines deeper in the forest. The weather that grounded Allied aircraft during the offensive's first week was equally miserable for ground forces on both sides. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit at night. Snow and freezing rain created conditions where frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units. Soldiers on both sides suffered from exposure, inadequate cold weather gear, and the exhaustion of continuous combat in brutal conditions. American forces, better supplied and able to rotate units, had some advantage. German forces advancing away from their supply bases and unable to evacuate casualties or bring forward reinforcements effectively suffered disproportionately. The artillery duel that raged throughout the battle demonstrated the industrial disparity between the sides. German artillery, concentrated for the initial barrage, expended most of its ammunition in the first days. American artillery, drawing on seemingly unlimited ammunition stocks, maintained sustained fire throughout the battle. German commanders reported that American artillery response to any German movement was immediate and overwhelming. Forward observers, equipped with radio communications far superior to German equivalents, could call down battalion-level fire strikes within minutes. The American artillery doctrine of massed fires, where multiple battalions could concentrate on single targets, proved devastating in the close terrain of the Ardennes. German columns forced onto predictable roads by the terrain were ideal targets for time-on-target strikes, where shells from multiple batteries arrived simultaneously, giving defenders no warning and no chance to take cover. German after-action reports describe entire companies caught in the open and effectively destroyed by single American artillery strikes. The role of combat engineers in the battle cannot be overstated. American engineers, racing ahead of retreating infantry, demolished bridges, cratered roads, and prepared demolitions on every structure that might aid German advance. The bridge demolitions were particularly effective because the Ardennes river valleys, cut deep into the plateau, had few crossing sites. Each destroyed bridge forced German columns to detour miles to find alternate crossings, burning precious fuel and consuming irreplaceable time. The most famous bridge demolition occurred at Trois Ponts, where a single engineer squad destroyed 3 bridges ahead of Kampfgruppe Peiper, forcing the German spearhead to detour and ultimately contributing to its entrapment. The engineers who set those demolitions, working under small arms fire from advancing German reconnaissance units, bought time measured in hours, but those hours proved decisive. Peiper's column, forced to detour, ran into American blocking positions that hadn't existed when the original route was clear. German engineers tasked with repairing demolished bridges and clearing obstacles worked under impossible conditions. They lacked heavy equipment, adequate materials, and air cover. American fighter bombers, once the weather cleared, specifically targeted bridge repair sites, destroying temporary bridges as fast as German engineers could erect them. The few bridges that German forces managed to repair or capture intact became critical choke points where entire divisions were forced to wait their turn to cross, while American artillery plastered the approaches. The fuel crisis that ultimately doomed the German offensive was predictable and predicted. German logistics officers had calculated that the available fuel could sustain the offensive for perhaps 5 days if everything went according to plan. After that, they would need to capture American fuel dumps or receive resupply through a supply line that stretched further each day through terrain under constant air attack. Neither occurred. American forces, warned by the initial attacks that German forces were advancing, evacuated or destroyed most forward fuel dumps. The few dumps captured by German spearheads contained diesel fuel or aviation gasoline, useless for German vehicles requiring standard automotive gasoline. The German supply system, barely adequate in the best conditions, collapsed under the strain of supporting a deep penetration through terrible terrain in winter. Supply trucks that should have been delivering ammunition and fuel to forward units were trapped in traffic jams that extended for miles. The narrow Ardennes roads, never designed for modern military traffic, couldn't handle the volume of vehicles required to sustain the offensive. A single breakdown or destroyed vehicle could block a road for hours while recovery teams cleared the wreckage. American interdiction of German supply lines, once Allied aircraft could fly, turned difficult logistics into impossible logistics. Every road and trail leading into the German salient became a target. Fighter bombers worked in relays, attacking anything that moved during daylight hours. German supply columns learned to move only at night, but night movement through unfamiliar terrain on roads clogged with combat traffic meant supplies arrived late or not at all. German panzer divisions reported that fuel deliveries that should have taken hours were taking days, and by the time fuel arrived the tactical situation had changed and the receiving unit had either withdrawn or been destroyed. The human cost of the battle was measured not just in casualties but in units destroyed as effective fighting forces. The 106th Infantry Division, overrun in the first days of the offensive, lost 2 entire regiments, nearly 7,000 men, in the largest American surrender since Bataan. These weren't soldiers who quit. They were soldiers surrounded, cut off from supply and support, who held their positions until ammunition was exhausted and further resistance was meaningless. The German forces that captured them gained prisoners but lost time, and time was the one commodity the offensive couldn't afford to waste. German casualties were proportionally higher because German doctrine emphasized attack, while American doctrine emphasized fire superiority. German infantry advancing through the forest against prepared American positions absorbed casualty rates that would have been considered prohibitive earlier in the war. But by December 1944, German manpower was so desperate that units were committed to attacks at half strength, with losses accepted as unavoidable. The Volksgrenadier divisions, improvised infantry formations created from Luftwaffe ground personnel, convalescent soldiers, and hastily trained recruits, suffered appalling losses. These divisions, lacking the training and cohesion of regular infantry, were expended in frontal attacks that achieved little beyond absorbing American defensive fires. The SS Panzer divisions, elite formations that spearheaded the offensive, were gutted. The 1st SS Panzer Division, which entered the battle with 22,000 men and 100 tanks, emerged with fewer than 10,000 men and 30 operational tanks. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, was effectively destroyed in futile attacks on Elsenborn Ridge, losing 80% of its infantry and most of its armour in exchange for 0 territorial gains. These were formations that Germany needed for defence of the homeland, expended instead in an offensive that achieved nothing. The Luftwaffe's effort during the battle demonstrated both the skill of German pilots and the hopelessness of Germany's situation. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a mass attack on Allied airfields designed to destroy Allied air superiority on the ground, since it couldn't be defeated in the air. Over 900 German aircraft, representing virtually every combat-capable plane in the West, struck Allied airfields at dawn. The attacks achieved surprise and destroyed nearly 300 Allied aircraft on the ground, mostly parked in the open. But the operation was a strategic disaster. German losses exceeded 300 aircraft and, critically, over 200 pilots killed or captured. The Allies replaced their aircraft losses within days, flying in replacement fighters from Britain and bringing forward planes from reserve stocks. Germany couldn't replace the pilots, experienced aviators who represented years of training that Germany no longer had time or resources to provide. The captured records showed that some pilots flying in Bodenplatte had less than 100 hours, total flight time, sent into combat against Allied pilots with hundreds of hours of experience. The air battle over the Ardennes, once weather-cleared, was one-sided slaughter. Allied fighters, operating from bases in France and Belgium, could loiter over the battlefield for hours. German fighters flying from bases deep in Germany had minutes of combat time before fuel exhaustion forced withdrawal. American pilots reported that German fighters would make one pass, then flee eastward, pursued by Allied fighters that had fuel and altitude advantage. The few German pilots who chose to engage found themselves outnumbered, outperformed, and outfought by Allied pilots in superior aircraft. The ground attack missions flown by Allied fighter bombers became legendary in their destructiveness. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, the same aircraft that had proven so effective against the Luftwaffe, now focused on ground targets. Flying in relays that maintained constant presence over the battlefield, Thunderbolts attacked anything that moved. The standard attack profile had flights of 4 aircraft working a sector, with one plane spotting targets while the others attacked. The spotting plane would mark targets with smoke rockets, then the strike planes would roll in with bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire. German soldiers reported that the psychological effect of constant air attack was as devastating as the physical destruction. The knowledge that movement in daylight meant immediate attack caused German units to hunker down during the day, moving only at night. But night movement through the Ardennes in winter, over roads clogged with destroyed vehicles and cratered by bombs, was agonizingly slow. The offensive that required rapid advance to succeed was reduced to crawling progress that consumed time and fuel without achieving objectives. The tank battle that occurred throughout the Ardennes demonstrated that German technical superiority in armour design couldn't overcome American numerical superiority and better tactical employment. German Tiger and Panther tanks were individually superior to American Shermans in armour protection and gunpowder. But American tank doctrine emphasized combined arms cooperation, using infantry, artillery, and air support to create situations where tank advantages could be exploited. German armour, forced onto predictable roads by terrain and shorter fuel, was vulnerable to American tank destroyers positioned in ambush. The M36 tank destroyer, armed with a 90mm gun, could penetrate the armour of any German tank at normal combat ranges. American doctrine positioned these vehicles in concealed positions, covering likely German approach routes, allowing them to engage from ambush at close range where even the Tiger's heavy armour was vulnerable. The narrow Ardennes roads forced German armour into single file, meaning an American tank destroyer could fire on a column where each vehicle blocked the one behind it. A single, well-placed M36 could stop an entire panzer company by destroying the lead tank and blocking the road. The most dramatic tank engagement occurred at Celle, where the 2nd Panzer Division, spearheading the German drive on the Meuse River, ran out of fuel just 3 miles from its objective. Immobilized, the division was systematically destroyed by converging American forces, including the 2nd Armoured Division, attacking from the north, and British armour moving from the west. German tankers, their vehicles out of fuel and ammunition, fought from static positions until overwhelmed. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had entered the Ardennes with 88 tanks, lost all of them at Celles along with most of its personnel. The battle illustrated the fundamental flaw in German planning. Even when tactical objectives were nearly achieved, even when German spearheads came within sight of their objectives, operational failure was baked into a plan that required resources Germany didn't have. The 2nd Panzer Division reached Celles not through superior tactics or equipment, but through sheer determination and the skills of experienced crews. But determination couldn't create fuel that didn't exist, or ammunition that couldn't be delivered through interdicted supply lines. The infantry combat that raged in villages throughout the Ardennes was vicious close quarters, fighting where American and German soldiers learned to hate the terrain they fought over. Villages became fortresses, stone buildings providing cover that the forest didn't offer, but village fighting negated German mobility advantages and played to American strengths in firepower and supporting arms. German forces attacking villages found that American defenders, supported by artillery and often by tanks firing in direct support, could exact prohibitive casualties. The fight for Bastogne became symbolic of the entire battle. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed into the town with minimal preparation, faced attacks by multiple German divisions desperate to seize the critical road junction. The American paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Market Garden, fought with skill and determination that impressed even their opponents. German attacks pressed home with courage were broken up by American defensive fires. German attempts to bypass the town failed because the road network didn't allow bypassing such a critical junction without creating impossible logistical tangles. The famous German surrender demand, delivered on December 22nd, requested that the American garrison surrender to avoid total annihilation. General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word response, "nuts," became one of the war's most famous quotes, symbolic of American determination. But the real story was in what happened after McAuliffe's refusal. The German forces surrounding Bastogne, unable to capture it and unable to bypass it, were forced to maintain siege operations that consumed forces needed elsewhere. The garrison that should have been overrun in hours tied down German divisions for a week, buying time that the faltering offensive couldn't afford. The relief of Bastogne by Patton's Third Army on December 26th demonstrated American operational capabilities that German planning had dismissed as impossible. The movement of 3 divisions 100 miles in winter conditions, reorganization from offensive to defensive orientation, coordination of attacks by units from different corps, and breakthrough to the surrounded garrison, all accomplished in less than a week. German staff officers, analysing the operation after the war, admitted they had believed such a manoeuvre would take at least 2 weeks, and probably longer. The battle's final phase, the elimination of the Bulge in January, was almost anticlimactic. German forces, short of everything, fought delaying actions as they withdrew to their start lines. The narrow roads that had channeled their advance now channeled their retreat, creating target-rich environments for Allied aircraft. German units that had advanced with full strength limped back as remnants, losing men and equipment to constant attacks during withdrawal. The psychological impact of the failed offensive on German morale was devastating. Soldiers who had been told this was Germany's last chance watched that chance fail despite their courage and sacrifice. The promises of victory, of turning the war around, of forcing the Allies to negotiate, all proved empty. The realization that Germany was fighting for nothing more than delayed defeat spread through units that had entered the battle believing Hitler's assurances. American morale, initially shaken by the surprise attack, rebounded as the situation stabilized and counterattacks began. The soldiers who had been pushed back in the first days watched German prisoners stream to the rear in increasing numbers and saw the wreckage of destroyed German equipment littering the roads. The propaganda that had portrayed the Germans as superhumanly dangerous was replaced by the reality that German soldiers were men who bled and died and surrendered when their situation became hopeless, just like soldiers of any army. The French and Belgian civilians caught in the battle zones suffered terribly. Towns that had been liberated in September were reoccupied by German forces in December, and civilians who had welcomed American liberators were now labelled as collaborators by returning Germans. Many were executed. Others fled westward as refugees, clogging roads needed for military movement and creating humanitarian crises that Allied forces were obliged to address even while fighting. The liberation of these towns a second time revealed atrocities that hardened American attitudes toward German forces and eliminated what little sympathy remained for Germany's situation. The Eastern European soldiers found in German units, Poles and Russians pressed into service by Germany's manpower crisis, surrendered enthusiastically when opportunity arose. These men had no loyalty to Germany and wanted only to survive. Their presence in German units testified to how desperate Germany's situation had become, conscripting even conquered peoples to fill depleted ranks. American intelligence officers interrogating these prisoners gained insights into German morale and capabilities that official reports never acknowledged. The war crimes committed during the battle, particularly the Malmedy massacre, where Waffen-SS troops murdered American prisoners, created lasting bitterness. American forces who discovered the bodies of their comrades shot in the back of the head while their hands were raised in surrender needed no further motivation. The massacre eliminated whatever restraint might have existed. German soldiers attempting to surrender to American units sometimes found their surrenders refused, particularly by units that had lost men at Malmedy or discovered similar atrocities. The investigation and trials that followed the war brought some perpetrators to justice, but many escaped. The commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, Joachim Peiper himself, was tried for war crimes and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted. The junior officers and enlisted men who actually committed the murders largely disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. The massacre remained a source of anger for American veterans for the rest of their lives, a reminder that the enemy they had faced was capable of barbarism as well as military skill. The final accounting of the Battle of the Bulge showed casualties that made it the bloodiest American battle in Europe. Nearly 90,000 American casualties, including 19,000 killed, the highest American losses in any single battle of the war. German casualties were higher, estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000, but the exact numbers were never established because German record-keeping collapsed toward war's end. Equipment losses were staggering on both sides. Americans lost over 700 tanks and tank destroyers. Germans lost a similar number, plus irreplaceable supplies of fuel and ammunition. But the strategic impact was entirely one-sided. Americans replaced their losses within weeks, bringing forward new divisions, new equipment, and new supplies from seemingly inexhaustible reserves. Germans couldn't replace anything. The forces expended in the Ardennes were needed desperately in the east, where Soviet armies were preparing their final offensive into Germany itself. The fuel consumed in the failed Western offensive was fuel that Germany's industry couldn't replace under Allied bombing. The pilots lost in futile air operations were pilots who might have defended German cities against bomber attacks. The what-if questions that historians love to debate are particularly interesting regarding the Battle of the Bulge. What if the weather had remained poor longer, keeping Allied aircraft grounded? The answer is probably that German forces would have advanced further before running out of fuel, only to be destroyed further from their start lines when the weather cleared. What if American forces had broken and retreated in panic as German planning assumed? The answer is that American operational reserves were so large that even breakthrough would have been contained and destroyed by forces that German planning never considered. What if Germany had pursued von Rundstedt's limited objective plan instead of Hitler's grandiose Antwerp scheme? The answer is that limited objectives might have been achievable, but would have accomplished nothing strategic, buying perhaps weeks of time at costs Germany couldn't afford. The reality is that the Battle of the Bulge was a strategic absurdity from conception. Germany, lacking resources for defence, launched an offensive requiring resources it didn't possess to achieve objectives that wouldn't change the strategic situation even if achieved. The miracle isn't that the offensive failed, but that it came as close to success as it did, testimony to the skill and courage of German soldiers fighting for a cause that was already lost. The lessons learned from the battle were implemented immediately by Allied forces. Never again would difficult terrain be considered adequate defence without adequate troops. Never again would the assumption that the enemy wouldn't attack somewhere be considered sufficient reason to leave that somewhere lightly defended. The doctrine of defence in depth, with strong reserves positioned to counterattack penetrations, became standard. The assumption that Allied forces had learned from others' mistakes and wouldn't repeat the errors that had doomed France in 1940 had proven false. Now, having paid for the lesson in American blood, the lesson was truly learned. The Ardennes battlefield today is peaceful forest and farmland, marked by monuments and cemeteries that hint at what occurred there. American cemeteries hold the remains of thousands who fell in the winter forest. German cemeteries, less visited and less maintained, hold thousands more. The Belgian and French civilians killed in the crossfire are commemorated in village memorials throughout the region. The forest has reclaimed the foxholes and gun positions, though careful searchers can still find fighting positions and shell fragments 7 decades later. The veterans who survived, American and German, largely avoided discussing their experiences for years after. The psychological trauma of combat in the Ardennes winter was severe, and post-traumatic stress wasn't recognized or treated in the 1940s. Men who had fought through the battle returned to civilian life carrying memories they couldn't share and nightmares they couldn't escape. Only decades later, when historians began serious study of the battle, did many veterans begin discussing what they had experienced. The lasting impact of the Battle of the Bulge on military doctrine extended far beyond World War II. The principle that terrain doesn't provide security without adequate forces became fundamental to NATO defensive planning during the Cold War. The recognition that surprise can be achieved even when intelligence provides warning if commanders refuse to believe the intelligence shaped how intelligence reports were evaluated. The understanding that difficult terrain complicates operations for attackers and defenders equally influenced how modern military forces approach operations in restricted terrain. The battle remains studied at military schools worldwide as an example of how operational ambition unsupported by adequate resources guarantees failure regardless of tactical skill. German tactical execution during the offensive was often excellent, but tactical excellence couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. American initial failures followed by effective response demonstrate the importance of resilience and depth in military forces. The side that can absorb setbacks and respond effectively has advantages that initial tactical success can't overcome. For the soldiers who fought there, the Battle of the Bulge was simply where they fought in winter, where friends died in frozen forests, where they learned that survival was often luck rather than skill. The strategic significance, the operational lessons, the historical importance, none of that mattered to men trying to stay alive in sub-zero cold, while other men tried to kill them. The grand narrative of armies and offensives and strategic objectives reduces to individuals in specific places at specific times, doing what they had to do because they were there and there was no alternative. The terrain that had been declared impassable twice proved passable twice, and both times the passage led to battles that shaped history. The Ardennes forest didn't prevent military operations, it shaped them, complicated them, made them more difficult and more costly, but it didn't prevent them. The lesson, written in the snow and blood of two major battles, is that military impossibility is often just military difficulty, and determined forces with adequate preparation can pass through terrain that theory says should stop them. The generals who believed otherwise learned their error, though the price of that education was paid by soldiers who deserved better leadership than they received.